Welcome back to the Why Mindset Matters podcast. I'm Eslana Loa. I'm an author, speaker, resilience mindset coach. I'm a nurse, a midwife, and a mother of 4. And if this is somehow the first episode of mine that you have found, I do want to start with a trigger warning. I do discuss the loss of my teenage daughter, Rylee, to suicide. I thought I would discuss my upcoming book. I discuss it in so many environments and on different platforms so much that I just thought everybody that kind of has found me would know about it, but I'm realizing I haven't actually. I don't think I've mentioned it in any podcast episodes, but this one is about my book called Resilience After Great Loss, Learning to Live and Grieve Simultaneously. So in the aftermath of losing Rylee, I was writing for years throughout my life before losing Rylee. If anyone heard stories of my upbringing or things that I had been through, they would often say, "Oh my God, you should write a book." And I would think, who wants to read a book about childhood sexual abuse and neglect and all of these horrible things? But that wasn't what it was about. It was about who I was in spite of these things happening, and that I was not going to be defined by my origins or the sum of where I had come from or what had happened to me along the way. And I realize now that it was more about that. It was more about, I guess, resilience and hope, really, I guess. But then I lost Rylee in the most horrific way I could imagine. And for those who don't know, Rylee jumped off my balcony 33 stories in the air with her sisters and I home, and I had to go down and find her. And then I was screaming so loud that the girls heard me from 33 stories and they came down and they saw her. We had no warning, seemingly future-oriented kid, really bright, academic excellence, kindest kid you've ever met. So our life was completely shattered in an instant, and no clarity around it either, because the police took her phone that night and then didn't give it back for 4 months. So it was a whole months of just trying to piece together anything to try and make sense out of this. And so obviously in the aftermath of trauma like that, I could barely sleep, and I would often get through sleepless nights by just writing. And I knew for a period of time that one day I would write a book. The way that I was writing, I thought, if this is about grief and the unfolding of it, it's going to take me years to write this. Anyway, it was around 2 years after losing Rylee, so Christmas time, our last Christmas that we had, I accidentally deleted 2 years of writing. My middle daughter, Mia, needed a new computer. Her computer died and she was heading into year 11. And at the time I thought I didn't have the money to buy her a new one. So I was clearing my Mac to give it to her. And I saw my book in the trash and I went, "Oh no, restore that." And the computer went, no, that's not going to happen. Unable to restore. And I just sat there for a moment and took a deep breath. And something that I've told the girls is I don't want emotional attachment to physical things. I didn't ever want a grief-associated meltdown because they lost the necklace, for instance, with her ashes in it, or some kind of emotional exacerbation of grief because of a physical or the loss of, or the perceived loss of something physical. And so I had to take my own advice because that's what we have to do as parents. And I sat with it and I went, you know what? It's all still in me. If I wanted to write it again, I could. But then the longer I sat with it, the more that I realized that I wouldn't write it from the same place. I had been writing from a place of trauma about the trauma. And 2 years into my learning to live and grieve simultaneously, I was in a completely different place. And something that I realized is from early days when people would hear or talk to me about what we'd been through and losing Rylee, they would almost all of the time say the same thing, the same narrative, the same words. "Oh my God, how the fuck are you still standing? How are you surviving? I couldn't, I wouldn't." And whether it was men, women, different ages, always the same thing. You hear that, you hear anything that specific on repeat enough times, you start to question, what the fuck am I doing? What is it? I'm not special. What is it that's making people think that I'm doing something that they couldn't do? And so I was evaluating, what is it? Like, what are we doing? What is it that we're doing differently, if you want to call it that, but in a way that doesn't seem familiar or doable? And as I started to evaluate all of the things that have been, yes, a big part of my life prior to losing Rylee, and obviously that made it easier to implement them in the aftermath of trauma and into our grief journey. But these weren't special things. These were like the daily practice of gratitude being one of the most powerful ways to navigate grief. And I'm not talking about toxic positivity or toxic optimism where we just sugarcoat everything and say everything happens for a reason. I'm not talking about that kind of rubbish. I'm talking about being able to use the daily practice of gratitude as like an insurance policy to be able to navigate the inevitable storms of life, because although your storms will not look like mine, and I hope that they don't, there's an inevitability of grief and loss associated with our lived experience. I believe our contractual agreement with this life is that I get to be here and love and have passion and adventure, but I will also experience grief and sadness at the absence of the very things that I loved and appreciated and the people. And so if it's a part of the journey, it's as sure as death and taxes is that we will experience grief and loss in our life. And yes, I hope that it is minimal comparatively, but again, I would not compare. And I did do an episode on comparison being the thief of joy, because that was the other thing that I found is when people would discuss anything with me and they'd bring up something that was traumatic or grief related for them, they would almost always go, oh, but it doesn't compare to what you've been through, and apologetically. And what I found is that when we put our grief or our trauma or our loss next to each other in an attempt to compare, and in doing so feel bad for that comparison and so lower our experience in order to not be offensive, what we do is invalidate our lived experience. And it doesn't matter what the environmental factors of your grief looks like. It doesn't matter if somebody's grief is associated with, we had to put our Rottweiler to sleep. And if he was the most genuine, unconditional form of love that I had ever experienced, and I lost him and I was stuck in the trenches of grief, unable to function and overwhelmed by the absence and the loss, why does the environmental factors of who it was or when it happened or whatever, or other people's perception of what that grief should look like, matter? What matters is the effect that grief and the absence of that particular thing that we loved so dearly and held so closely, the horrific nature of catastrophic effect that can have on our capacity to function or our capacity to find joy or meaning in our life. And so I would encourage people not to compare the environmental factors, because what's more important is validating your lived experience. And your lived experience is no less value or valid than mine, because mine carries with it a story of like horrific trauma. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. And it shouldn't be that's necessary in order for validation, because what happens is we need to validate our lived experience, validate our grief and loss in order to walk through the doorway that validation facilitates, and in doing so facilitate the joy and the, peace and all of the things that can coexist in our life simultaneously alongside grief. We don't have to trade one for the other. We don't have to be stuck in grief and therefore you cannot have happiness or joy or contentment or peace. It's not one or the other. There is the capacity that we all have to learn to live and grieve simultaneously, and that the presence of grief and sadness does not negate or invalidate the capacity I have for joy or happiness or contentment. And that if I am defining myself as happy and content or joy-filled, it doesn't mean I'm no longer sad. There's a sadness that will reside in me forever. And I'm okay with that, because I am learning. I won't say I have learned, because I believe the learning is lifelong and I'm in this for the journey, but I'm learning how to live and grieve simultaneously. And I feel like I'm doing a pretty good job of it. But again, that depends day to day. It can be, today's a lot more challenging, for instance. I don't know why, but just walking into a shopping center that I've been to a million times, that we used to go to because that was our local one and we lived nearby it, never affects me. But today, walking through the doors, I was trying so hard not to cry. No feeling in particular, no words I could put to it, but just going to certain environments lately, sometimes that's the nature of grief. You don't know what's going to set it off or what's going to, I feel like the challenges I'm dealing with in my life at the moment, how I would define it is my soul is tired. it's tired, and I'm trying to not let the exhaustion my soul has with carrying all of this stuff and then having extra challenges laid on not lead to resentment, because I don't want to resent any part of my life. I am actually grateful to still be here. I'm actually grateful for so much and everything really in my life. And so in evaluating all of this, I realized that I would not write the book from the same place, and that I would write it about a resilience born of gratitude. And that's what I've done. And I've really dug deep into what it is that I have implemented or used or practiced with the girls to be able to be in this position just over 2.5 years down the track, defining myself as the happiest that I've ever been. And on paper, that doesn't make sense to a lot of people because of the elements of trauma and grief. But like I said, it's understanding that one doesn't rule out the capacity for the other or the presence of the other. And so where that left me was a lot more motivated to get serious about the book. I'd been writing, but I had no idea how you put a book together, how you structure it, what's involved. And it's funny when you start acting with intention and you really start, and this was all aligned around the same time that I found the book on manifesting. If you haven't listened to that episode, do yourself a favor. I am going to do another episode soon about manifesting, and just bit of a brag session, I think, about all the cool shit I've been manifesting, and in an endeavor to share it as motivation for you to do your own manifesting. But I had found the 369 journal. I was tapping into the power that I have to manifest. I got intentional, and I believe I manifested deleting that writing. I believe that that was a part of the journey, and I truly believe that even when things aren't working out, they're always working out. That's been a big motto of mine through manifesting, because I've realized that the things that we can start to resent or think aren't working out the way we thought that they were supposed to, or that our ego would have said that they should have, are getting out of the way for the way that it's supposed to work out. And I'll get into that more in the manifesting episode, but I believe that that happened to create an opportunity for me to evaluate everything the way I've just explained, for me to look at it differently and realize that I actually had a book in me worth writing, not just one that was like a bit heavy and a little bit motivational. I'm talking about not writing from a place of trauma about the trauma, but writing from a place of resilience about the human spirit and the capacity we all have to learn how to live and grieve simultaneously, and the acknowledgement that if a part of my contractual agreement with life is that I will experience grief and loss, and if we know that those storms are going to come for us, we can use gratitude, for instance, and the things I talk about in the book as an insurance policy to be able to weather those storms in a way that sees them be kinder and softer to us. Not kind and soft, because let's be real, that's not storms, but take the storms and have them be that slightly kinder and softer versions, and be the version of ourselves that is a lot more solid in our capacity to understand that I've got what it takes to be able to not just weather this storm, but facilitate the ability to not just survive, but learn how to thrive. And so when I started getting more intentional and was manifesting, I happened to have this beautiful connection with an amazing woman that I hadn't seen in years. We'd gone to uni 20 odd years before, and she booked in for cosmetic tattoo. We got talking and obviously catching up and about the loss of Rylee and everything. And after that appointment, she messaged me and said, I'm writing a book. I really love listening to your perspective on life. I wonder if you would answer these questions for me about your perspective on what you think happiness is. And so I sat with it, and that got me writing more stuff on my perception of happiness. And I know I've mentioned it in a podcast episode, but I do go deeper into it in the book. But we met for coffee, and she's like, man, you should write a book. I said, oh, I actually am. And so that facilitated us having a really conscious conversation around a book coach that she had who does Zoom calls via Melbourne. And so I reached out to this woman thinking I would have a Zoom call to get some guidance, because she'd written a book that was all about how to self-publish. It told you everything you needed to know. And she happened to say, I'm like a week out from starting a 12-week course. Would you be interested? So instead of this one-on-one, I ended up doing a group course with her earlier in the year for 12 weeks. And it was an incredible experience, just really filling the gaps. I know I talk in a previous episode about how the thing that stands between us and achieving our goals or success is not whether I have the capacity to be an author or to write a book or whatever. Of course I do. We all do. And even those of you who are sitting out there going, oh, I'd love to write a book, but I don't know how to write, or I can't write creative. It doesn't matter. That's what ghostwriters are for. You can tell them your story or your life story or your lived experience, and they are the creative pen that puts that story to paper for you, and you are the author. And I'd always been really good at writing and finding my words, and so I didn't need that particular service. But I want to make that point for anyone who's listening, because I've come across a lot of people that I've talked to and gone, oh man, I'd really like to write a book, but then the hesitation is that they think they need to be everything. And you don't need to be everything. You can be the talent, you can be the passion, you can be this, and then you fill the gaps, fill those buckets between where you are and where it is you need to be in order to achieve that goal. And go write a book or do whatever it is that is your goal that you think you can't do because you are currently under some kind of narrative that says you need to be all the ingredients in the recipe. You don't. Anyway, back to me trying to be all the ingredients. I did this workshop, and it was everything from the format of the book. There's so much that goes into writing a book, as in you have to buy the ISBN like barcodes for the international library records of your book, but you have to get a different one for every format the book comes in, ebook, Kindle, all this stuff, right? And I'm not saying this to overwhelm anyone who's listening with a curious ears for or interest in doing it themselves. 100% doable. All very simple once somebody lays it out for you and goes, this is the process, do this, this, and this, get an editor, book cover design, all of these things. And so again, I could have sat in overwhelm. I could have maybe written the book and never ever published it because I got overwhelmed with all these things between where I am and where it is that I needed to be. But it was just perfect. This is the thing about manifesting, is it's not just writing down the things that you'd like to magnetize into your life. It's sure, write them down, but then act with intention. Say yes to life. Put yourself in rooms. If I hadn't said yes to Harmony and having coffee with her, I wouldn't have found myself having conversations that opened up another dialogue about a book coach, or that opened up a dialogue about a 12-week course. And so I'm writing the book throughout this time period, but life kept getting in the way. And I became very familiar with the powerful force that is procrastination, and how incredible I am at creating art or renovating or cleaning your house when I really want to write. And that negative self-talk that gets in our way of when you find yourself procrastinating, it is, getting in the way of you achieving your goals. And if we really dig deep, we usually find there's some kind of imposter syndrome there. And for me, that's what it was. It was, who do you think you are to write a book? Or who do you think would want to read your book? Or all this ugly talk underneath the surface that I would never speak to anybody else like that. And I didn't even know I was doing it to myself. It was happening in such a deceitful, coated way, presenting as procrastination, and that procrastination wasn't even being named as that. It was like, look at me, I love doing art or renovation or whatever. And it's easy to see the positive in that. Look at what you're achieving. I don't know how you get all this shit done. It's like, actually, I'm doing everything but the very thing I want to be doing. And that's write the book, because I'm having trouble believing in myself. And so there was a whole journey this year since Christmas time of overcoming imposter syndrome, working with that negative self-talk and narrative to be able to get out of my own way and really stop self-sabotaging. And so what happened then was I had committed to going to Bali to finish writing the book. Just give myself time where nobody needed anything from me. There was no art to be made, no kitchen to renovate, no excuses. Just going as my solo writer's retreat with the intention of finishing this book, because a good portion of it was done. But you'd be amazed how much you can write on a 6-hour flight when you really just zone in and commit. And I did that. I found the most beautiful hills of Ubud and cafes to sit in for 6-7 hours a day, and I wrote. And I wrote a book. I finished my book. I am very proud of what I've created and what I've facilitated as a result of how I have chosen, consciously and subconsciously, how I want to deal with my grief and trauma, and who I have allowed myself to become as a result of it, and what I haven't let it do to me. And as I said before, I'm not special. I'm not different. I maybe have some tools that I'm doing and implementing and consciously investing in myself and my life that are different to how you might be instinctively or innately carrying yourself through life. But the beauty is they're all very simple things that if we implement them in our daily life, they become like a torch that helps guide the way. So although we can't avoid the storms, we can certainly light up the path as we do to facilitate being able to see that we have the capacity to keep putting one foot in front of the other. Because it's when we doubt that capacity, when we get lost in the quicksand and the darkness and we can't see one foot in front of ourselves, that we're convinced that this grief or this trauma or this sadness is going to be all consuming and the total destruction of me. And that doesn't need to be the case. And rock bottom does not need to be the end of you. It can be the beginning of a beautiful becoming. And that's what this book is about. And I only mention the details of Rylee's death or that she was bullied or groomed to give weight to the savagery of how in an instant our life changed. I don't do it to trauma bond or to trauma dump on anyone or to even bring that much attention to those elements, because that's not what's important. What's important is what we've done with it. The elements of our life that we can't control are so many, and perhaps Rylee's term here was always meant to be 15 years. And if it was something that I was telling the woman who was planning her celebration of life the week after she passed was, had I known she was only on loan to me for 15 years, I wouldn't have done anything differently. I loved her with every fiber of my being, and she knew that. And that was the last big conversation that we had, me telling her how much I loved her, how much she meant to me. And she hugged me for the longest time and told me how much she loved me. And I'm so grateful that I lived from a place of conscious parenting, that I didn't have my grief layered with guilt, regret, or shame because I was unkind to her or whatever it was. And so I speak about the power of all of these things because for years before losing Rylee, I, as a midwife, taught antenatal workshops called Why Mindset Matters in Childbearing. And it was a workshop that helped people prepare for labor and birth but avoid birth trauma, because your key to avoiding unnecessary birth trauma has less to do with the environmental factors of how your birth plays out and everything to do with how you take ownership over the journey, don't give your power away, don't end up on someone else's agenda, that you're making informed decisions and providing informed consent. And you can go in, for instance, wanting a water birth and walk away from an emergency cesarean going, we fucking did it. We had our best birth, if you do what I've just said. And so that was my superpower, was teaching about how to really take ownership over that part of your life. And the reason that I think so many men really loved the workshop is they'd come thinking that this was a workshop about babies and vaginas, and then leave feeling so empowered, because it's a series of life skills and perspectives that if you hone it in on pregnancy, labor and birth, it becomes that powerful torch. And that's why I think it was so powerful and they loved it. And of course I prepared them for all possibilities, and that was a big part of the empowerment. And then another part of the workshop was about conscious parenting and our relationship with and to our children. And so a lot of what I write about in the book, what I talk about on the podcast, what has been the life raft that has helped keep my head above water in the darkest of days when I'm convinced that my trauma and grief would consume me, has been the things that I taught, that I lived, that I practiced. And I do that. Everything that I speak about, I'm living it. I'm consciously invested in always bringing my A game and trying to live the fuck out of this life, because as much of a roller coaster as it is, I'm so grateful to be here. I'm so grateful to have been her mum and to have loved her and been loved by her. I'm so grateful for my children, for everyone in my life, everyone. And for the sense of community and connection that has formed around me in the aftermath of losing Rylee. and facilitated my growth and my not just surviving, but thriving, learning how to thrive. And so that's the back end. And again, I will do another episode and talk in more detail about the Why Mindset Matters in Childbearing workshop, because although I don't practice in the hospital as a nurse or a midwife anymore, I still do deliver the workshops, and will in the coming months be moving to a Zoom platform so that anyone anywhere can access it, because it doesn't matter who you are, where you live, who you intend on birthing with, public, private, under a tree, by a stream. What matters is that you are empowered and that you take ownership and that you don't give your power away. Because of that, there isn't anyone that the workshop wouldn't benefit. And so I very much look forward to taking it to a broader audience, so it will have its own episode. But I wanted to give you that backstory and history as to how and why I found myself here. And even years ago, like this all started back in 2015, these workshops. And I knew for years that there would be some series of some kind of around Why Mindset Matters. And here we are with the podcast. So it seems appropriately fitting, and it's definitely something that I'm enjoying very much. I still struggle with self-doubt. I never really know what the episode is going to be about until I sit down that day. I've usually got a couple of topics floating around in my head, and then something will kind of come to the forefront in one way or another, and here we are making the episode. But there's all the downtime in between that, where you still have to combat the niggling residual imposter syndrome that tries to come back and go, can I please reside in the base of your soul, and make you question whether you should be doing this, or whether you have enough topics in your mind or in your soul to be sharing this, or who would want to listen. But then the beautiful balance occurs when I get incredible messages from people saying how much it's benefiting them having this shared experience, and how much they get from the episodes, or a couple of people how they believe it saved them in their grief. And I want nothing more than to be able to have a shared experience with people that validates your lived experience, that helps acknowledge the capacity that you have to learn how to live and grieve simultaneously, and that you 100% have this capacity for resilience after great loss. And that if you are fortunate enough to be on the pre-grief and trauma side or loss, where life hasn't really come for you yet, not too massively, then that's an exciting place to be, because the things I talk about in the book, in the podcast, everything is very much stuff that you can start to implement now and use like that insurance policy for the inevitable challenges that will come, because life is a roller coaster and sometimes it's a bitch, but grief is definitely a bitch, and none of us get out of life scot-free. We just don't. It's a part of our lived experience in one way or another. And the only way to avoid grief and loss is to not live. It's to not love. It's to not have any kind of enjoyment, because the vulnerability that it takes for us to be courageous enough to open ourselves up to being loved, to the enjoyment, the connection of life, is the very thing that puts us at risk of loss. But it can be beautiful. It really can. And so I finished writing the book. I came back from Bali, and God, it was hard to get back into life after having this incredible time away, just eating the most incredible food. I didn't know Bali could be like that. I stayed up in Ubud, surrounded by trees, just eating the most beautiful food and having a really relaxing reset, which was invaluable and life-changing for me. And I came back, and a lot of clients of mine from my cosmetic business, or people in my life or on my social media, like, oh my God, so now how do we buy the book? And I wish it was that simple, but there's a lot more that goes into it than simply putting the words to paper. So unfortunately, all the things between me and it going to print are just money. They're chores that are simple to do, but the thing that stands in the way is money. So I have to get an editor, I have to design a book cover, I have to get those barcodes and the ISBNs and do all of the fiddly stuff that goes into prepping it so that it is ready. And then when it is ready, it will go onto platforms like Amazon and so forth, where anyone can order it and they print at the time of order. So I don't have to pay a heap of money to have a lot of books printed and then sit on those books. It's a brilliant advancement, I guess, of technology, that you don't have to be picked up by a big bookstore or have a whole lot of investment in books printed, as I said. So that's exciting. But then the marketing and everything that goes into it, so that hopefully it actually does end up in bookstores, because as I put it out to the beta readers for feedback, one of the people that I gave it to was a psychologist that I really trust, and had asked her for feedback. And her feedback was that it was a really powerful, emotional, and beautiful piece of work that I had created, and it's something that she genuinely believed everyone should read. And that she'd even learnt some amazing things through what she'd read so far, and that she'd, even though she hadn't read the whole thing, she wanted to touch base and just pass on the feedback as far as how powerful a message this was and how there wasn't anyone that wouldn't benefit from reading it. And that just reinforces that there's a lot still to go for me as far as getting it out there, but I really have a vision for this. And the book is just a little part of it. I have no problem finding my voice or I recognize the vulnerability of speaking very frankly and honestly about everything that I do, and my capacity to be okay with my not okayness when grief is heavy, and acknowledge all the messy and less beautiful parts of life as my strength. And I love finding my voice, and I look forward to all of the ways, the doors that will open as a result of the things that I'm doing, and the ways that I can continue to share these messages around why our mindset matters and how we can have this resilience born of gratitude, and implement the things that I talk about in the book. So it's a exciting beginning. It's not the be all and end all by any means, and I hope that it has the reach that I envision for it, because I don't believe, much like the psychologist that I gave it to said, that there's anyone that wouldn't benefit from reading it. And so that's where I'm at. That's where the book is at. So watch this space, and I hope to be able to bring it to fruition sooner rather than later. But I've very much enjoyed the ride so far, and I know that I have more to share, more books in me. So that's exciting too, to be able to birth this first. But that is the story of resilience after great loss, learning to live and grieve simultaneously. That's the story so far anyway. So watch this space. Follow me on Instagram at @EslanAloa, and that will facilitate you keeping up to date with where I'm at with the book launch and everything. In the time since I'm confident I mentioned the co-authoring opportunity in the manifesting episode, but have a listen to that too, because in the same time frame as me manifesting and connecting with the book coach and all of these things, and I started to say, I'm going to be an international bestselling author and speaker and coach, I'm going to be an international bestselling author, I ended up connecting with a man that I mentioned in that episode, Marco Robinson, who presented an opportunity for me to co-author a book in the series of books called Start Over, Turning Any Loss into a Sensational Comeback. And so I'm also co-authoring the first book in the second volume of those. So what he's done is created a series of books. There's 12 in the first, and they're currently being released throughout this year. Between now and March, I think, because my book number 1 in volume 2 comes out in March next year. And so it's a series of books about resilience and the human spirit, and these incredible stories about people who've come from homelessness, whatever they've done, or their successes in life, whatever it is, or come back from the brink and rock bottom not being, the end for them, but this beautiful new becoming. And so there's 14 different authors in each book in the series. And as I mentioned, I have the privilege of being one of the co-authors in the first book of the second volume. But you can find the series of books, or the ones that have been released so far, on Amazon, and it's called Start Over, Turn Any Loss into a Sensational Comeback. But yes, his endeavor was to create a essentially global movement of acknowledging the human spirit and the capacity we all have to do better than just survive, to not just survive in the aftermath of unimaginable grief, trauma. There's amazing stories in there. There's everything that you could possibly think of makes up these books. And it's another privilege that I feel really grateful to be a part of. And in November, I think it's Sydney we're going to speak in promoting the book. And then there'll be different stages throughout the world next year that we will continue to go and market the second volume of the book. So I look forward to doing that as well. So it's all happening and I'm very much enjoying it. And I wanted to share that with you guys because it wasn't something I delved into as much as I have or might have on the other platforms of my social media. So thank you so much for listening. I'm @EslanAloa. You can follow me on Instagram @EslanAloa. I very much look forward to sharing everything that is coming in the future episodes with you very shortly. So see you in the next ep.